John Pop there, and Alfonso Liddell. I know he's here also. So I would say we have everybody present and accounted for, with the exception of John, and again, Chris should be here shortly. We do have a quorum.
Thank you, sir. So, Nasser Paydar is the president of AUPUI, chancellor, and have done a fantastic job. I was so impressed with how your graduation rates have dramatically improved.
Thank you.
And thanks for your hospitality, and we look forward to your remarks.
Thank you so much. On behalf of IUPUI, I want to welcome all of you to our wonderful campus. I want to thank you for your attention and focus on student success. I'm delighted that you gave us an opportunity over lunch to talk about the way IUPUI focuses on student success and the way we connect them for opportunities in Indiana. So again, thank you very much for all you do for our state and our students, and have a wonderful meeting right here at IUPUI. Thank you.
Thank you. Why don't we address this bylaw change now? Is Josh here? I'm trying to read this. Did you make that change that Teresa suggested in here or not?
Yes, so at the beginning of the section 12, we added in case of extraordinary circumstances. And as we mentioned,
Oh, I see, yeah.
this will sunset. We can address this more properly here in the June meeting, or extend it if necessary at that point in time.
Terrific. Is there a motion? Second. Any further discussion? All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, same sign. Thank you. I have some, I hate to use the word disappointing. Yeah, excuse me?
Thanks, Chris. Got you present.
Thank you. Colleen, congratulations to her. She has just secured an internship with Anthem. The good news is, but the bad news is they're sending her to New York. Boo. So she has made such a great contribution, and we're going to all miss her enormously. And we just learned, she just figured out this is her last meeting because we won't be meeting until June. So we will be passing a resolution to thank you for your outstanding service. And I know everyone here very much appreciates what you've done, and we hope you'll stay in touch with us and continue to make suggestions and ask questions and make a great contribution. And Anthem is indeed lucky to get you to go to New York.
It's really been a privilege to get to be a part of this board. And just this morning, I was thinking about what am I possibly going to do to fill the void that's going to be left by this opportunity. Getting to know all of you, but also getting to participate in this great mission has been one of the biggest honors of my life. It's been an incredibly enlightening experience, and has really given me, it's really left me with a feeling that I want to make sure that for the rest of my life that in some way I can help to further this mission, even though I won't get to have a chance to be a part of the board any longer. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. And good luck in New York, the Big Apple, and with the Anthem.
Thank you.
You'll be terrific.
It's only a short-term stint in New York, right?
Yes, yeah, it's a summer internship.
Coming back to
Yeah,
Indiana.
I'll be back in Indiana. That's fine.
So, let me see what's next. My instructions. Attorney Commissioner Lovers.
Thank you,
You have
Mr.
anything to say?
I always do. Seems like. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a few thoughts, because we've already had a very rich morning, I think, and I know we have some important things on the agenda for this afternoon. During this meeting this morning, we gave update on the recently concluded, as of midnight last night, legislative session, the College Value Index, and of course, ways that we're going to be communicating our strategic plan. All of these activities were not one and done kinds of things. Whether it was the legislation, we're already teeing up, as you know, for the budget session, so that is a continuing body of work for us to do. The College Value Index, we're really looking for ways to continue to provide value to that. We had a very good discussion this morning of ways that we could convey that to a broader market that could actually use it as well. And we will be on a regular basis revisiting the strategic plan in those ways in which I know Steph presented to you before about how we will be annually monitoring the work of the report. But one of the issues that we were not planning on was, of course, the one that's actually monopolized much of our conversation today, and that is all about the coronavirus. And I will say that the Commission has been serving sort of as an intermediary with the Department of Health and the Governor's Office and the colleges and universities, public, private, and proprietary, to identify the best source of contact there, that we can relay the most up-to-date information on a regular basis. Certainly, Chancellor Padar gave us a glimpse of the challenges at the university level, everything from whether it's a commencement or how you convert to online instruction, all of those things that they're working with. And it's clear that this is for all of us, no matter what you do in your daily life. This is an evolving situation for us, and one that we'll continue at the Commission to try to serve as that intermediary with our colleges and universities, knowing that they're the front line with the students and the staff and faculty. That was pointed out so vividly by Nasser today as well. And I've had conversations with several who have identified this growing need to make sure we have those test kits that we need for our campuses and for our students and for our staff. So on Monday, I had the opportunity to sit with Governor Whitcomb, and there were about 12 governors from around the state, with Vice President Pence and with all the health officials from DC, really talking about this evolving situation in ways that the federal government would try to be engaged with the states and those who were closest to the situation. So it influences our work already. We had to make a decision this week to cancel our interviews for the Next Generation Educator Scholarship. As you know, we provide up to 200 scholarships a year for people who are in the process of moving into the field of education. We do that first by an application process in which we rank all of those applications that come to us, and then we finalize that with interviews. The good news out of this is that we at least had a provision that made it clear that we were actually thinking that bad weather conditions might require us to make a change at some point. And it made it clear to those folks that if that happened, we would revert back to that application process and make the selections based on that. So we've already identified the 200 people who received that scholarship the next day, and put the rest that didn't, so the 200, and then there were about 30 that were put on the wait list as well. So I think this was something we did in response to concerns raised by parents. We had people coming to do the interviews, and it appeared that sometimes, as I mentioned earlier today, sometimes decisions are made easier because there's really no other alternative, and it kind of got to that situation in this circumstance. We also shared information this morning, and for those, as I look at the audience, everybody was here this morning as well, but we'll be notifying people that it is our intention to cancel the Weldon Conference as well. We regret that. We had a great keynote speaker coming from Aspen who was going to provide some great work information for us, but again, it appears that that's not a decision that we can really wait to notify people about. It's coming very quickly, right at the beginning of April, so right when we're seeing this escalation and the need to address it. On February 25th, I had the chance to attend and actually Chancellor Padar made mention of this as well, a recent event about charting the future for Indiana's colleges and universities. It's actually sponsored by Lilly Endowment. It was well attended. In fact, there were 24 college presidents there between public and private schools. I guess when you're going to allocate up to $108 million, people show up. There really were 3 phases for that. There was a planning phase where every college or university had an opportunity to get some funding for that. Then it moves into, after that phase, it actually moves into an implementation stage, and then there'll be what they call an invitational phase when they'll really provide a larger sum of money for the large-scale proposals. McKinsey & Company facilitated it and really provided great information on everything from the future of work to innovative models in higher education and everything about from what might happen with everything from mergers to closures of institutions in the country and how institutions could prepare for that. I think it's definitely worth noting that Purdue University recently announced that it would freeze for the 9th straight year their tuition, holding it from 2012 through the 2021-22 year. According to the university, 59% of Purdue West Lafayette students graduated debt-free in 2018, and that compares to a national average of 43%. So I think it's worth acknowledging that good work, particularly at Purdue, but all of our institutions who are really working to bend the cost curve in higher education. Last, I want to just mention a big picture view of the governor's workforce cabinet. I continue to try to bring you up to date on that because it aligns with the work of our strategic plan as well. I shared a little bit last time about what's called the WIOA plan. We received permission to actually do a different kind of plan this year that's focused on really the populations of people that we serve all the way from early childhood education to lifelong learning. With the good work, once again, of Doug, seems like we always call Doug out. He's got his earphones on, he can't even hear me, but we call him out almost every time for the good work he does with design. And we've been facilitating the work of the governor's workforce cabinet through the commission in a lot of their marketing efforts. So I provided a copy of this. It was, as you may remember, I mentioned the last time, over a 500-page document. Probably not something that everybody reads, but this gives you a sense of what it includes and what they're going to be focused on, and many ways in which I think it really does align with our strategic plan as well, and in particular, the 60% goal. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I will turn the meeting back over to you.
Thank you very much. Very exciting information. Sorry about the welded conference. I'm sure y'all read carefully our minutes. Is there a motion to approve them? There's, all in favor? Aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Alfonso, we got some bad news that you're going to have to step down because your wife is, Danielle is going to be Chancellor of...
I'll be taking him. So if the world doesn't come to an end, or we're still alive, I think my last meeting might be June.
Right.
Yeah, so we're very happy. She got the job. Very interesting process, I should say, where there were public forums and all that. But it was very, I think it was very good for the city, for the area, for the region, for the candidates, for everybody involved in that. So it was very good. So yeah, she starts Monday. And even though we're all very happy, I'm still, if you guys know of any chemical engineer with an MBA that works for free, let me know, please.
I would just say, Mr. Chairman, that we'll have an opportunity in June. That will be at Indiana State, and we've asked Alfonso to come back so we can do that. We'll obviously have a resolution for Colleen as well. Sorry that you won't be here. We just found that out today, but so, we'll have an opportunity to recognize that, but we wanted to give you a chance to just mention that today so people wouldn't be taken by surprise by your not being with us in the future.
That's right, but I appreciate it. I'm sure that we'll have an opportunity, but I have enjoyed this immensely. And finally, I think I was, I always say that she's the one with the brains and just a smiley face. So when I'm starting to understand everything that was happening here, so I'll see you guys, I guess.
Well, you made a great contribution, and we'll all miss you.
Thank you.
And congratulations to your wife and to both of you, your family, for her great new position.
Daniela will be great. I did say, when I talked to the governor's office about this, we were trying to find if there was any way we could justify continuing this way, but because of the nature of our work, it does make it impossible. But I have a strong feeling that you will see Alfonso showing up on another very important commission sometime in the near future.
Well, now we move to our public square, and I'm so excited about the opportunity that we're going to get to hear from Tim Rennick. Is that you, Tim, that I'm looking at right now?
Yeah, hi, good afternoon. This is Tim Rennick.
Yeah, well, I'm heard so many wonderful things about you and the incredible impact you had on Georgia State, and especially graduation rates, completion rates for students who come with students at risk. And I know that you have single-handedly had a huge impact and done a lot of thinking and writing about this challenge in our country, and we feel so fortunate that you are making the time to spend time with us. We're sorry you couldn't come up here, but we all understand, and we very much appreciate, we're looking forward to the opportunity. I know Teresa would like to say a couple of things before you begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much, Tim. It's been my privilege to have worked with Tim in several national organizations over many years, and while in fact Georgia State has done extraordinary things, I think it would not be an overstatement to say that the leader of those efforts is really what made the difference, and it's Tim Rennick, and he is asked to speak at forums all of the time. He's clearly focused with a passion, a mission on his part to actually improve the lives of students that they serve at Georgia State. And with no student left behind is, I think, sort of the philosophy that they have. We would have loved to have had him here with him, but his life is stressful enough, I'm sure, right now, in keeping with everything that's happening at school. And so we decided we could eliminate a little of his stress by doing it this way. It's not ideal. We found out that it may be difficult for him to hear some of the questions that are asked. So Liz is going to convey those questions to him. With Tim's understanding, you're welcome to stop during the presentation and ask questions, and certainly we'll have time at the end as well. As I mentioned, Tim, you should know that we heard from the chancellor here at IUPUI over lunch. There are so many similarities between the populations, their special populations that they're serving, their commitment to first generation, underrepresented populations, and it just is a perfect segue into what you're going to share with us too. So again, our thanks for joining us, and we'll turn the presentation over to you.
Well, thank you, Teresa, and thanks everybody for taking some time to talk about these issues amidst troubling times and depressing circumstances. This is going to be an upbeat presentation because it's going to underline the power that we all have to make substantive change in this space. So I'm going to call up my slides. Give me 1 second here to share my screen, which I hope is now being shared. Yes?
Yes.
Okay, very good. I'm going to tell a story about Georgia State, but I hope the lessons that I share will be very clear to be applicable to the Indiana context and indeed nationally. I'm going to start by underlining the challenge that we face. These data are from the New York Times. These represent the percent of Americans who actually hold a bachelor's degree, but the numbers are disaggregated by economic quartile. The chart basically covers the last 50 years from 1970 to the present. And what you can see is there have been significant changes in college attainment entirely in the upper half of the economic spectrum. So if you look at that blue line at the top, those are the top 25% of Americans by annual household income. On the far left, that's 1970. It indicates about 40% of the population from that group held the bachelor's degree back then. 50 years later, we're up to over 80%. That's fantastic, doubling the educational attainment for that particular subset of Americans. But you look at the bottom lines, especially that red line at the bottom of the chart, and it's a much more sobering picture. If you're among the 25% least wealthy Americans, your prospects of holding a college degree have changed very little. And in point of fact, the gap between the wealthiest and least wealthy Americans is not getting narrower. It's basically doubled over the last 50 or so years. So take those national data, add to them these, that over the last 6 or 7 years, we've crossed an important threshold across the United States. For the first time since these data have been collected, the majority of K through 12 public school children now qualify as low income. In fact, you can draw a line across the United States, roughly from the DC area through California. Almost every state south of that line has already crossed the 50% mark. In fact, my home state of Georgia here is over 60%, meaning 60% of the students in the K through 12 public pipeline in Georgia qualify as low income. Indiana is just on the threshold. You're at 49% currently. So you put these two national data sets together, they should give all of us pause, because we as a nation have not figured out how at scale to graduate low-income students from post-secondary institutions. We've got much better at admitting them, just not very good at graduating them. And yet that's the majority population working their way through the public school pipeline. It's also a good introduction to my home campus, Georgia State University. This is not just a pretty picture of Atlanta at twilight. That white building on the right is our largest campus building. Our business school is beside it, our law school, one of our classroom buildings. Georgia State's just mixed into downtown Atlanta. 34,000 students on this campus alone. As I'll talk about at the end of my comments, we were consolidated about 3.5 years ago with the largest community college in Georgia. So overnight we grew by 19,000 students. We now have 5 community college campuses we oversee and a total of 53,000 students across all of Georgia State. Now the reality is we are not a well-known institution historically. We're not Georgia Tech, the very elite public institution that's only about 2 miles north of us. We're also not the University of Georgia, the big football powerhouse up in Athens. If there's any claim to fame that Georgia State has historically, it may be our geography. We have the uncommon distinction of having our campus bisected by a National Park Service historic district. The Martin Luther King district cuts our campus in half. The office I'm sitting in right now is about 3-4 blocks away from that brick building at the bottom of the screen there. That's Ebenezer Baptist Church, where the Reverend King and his father before him were both head pastors. You walk up the street a couple more blocks, you get to his gravesite. His tomb is right off the downtown Atlanta streets, and a couple blocks after that is this yellow-colored house, which is his childhood home and his birthplace. So we're living and working every day at Georgia State in this geography that is infused with historical significance. And yet, for much of our history, we didn't live up to that legacy. I pulled these pictures from the Georgia State photo archives. This is what Georgia State looked like when the Reverend King was living and doing his groundbreaking civil rights work. You know, we were a segregated campus well into the 1960s. Think of the sad irony there that this, world-renowned civil rights leader is working, preaching, living a couple blocks away from this institution, which is the embodiment of everything that he's fighting against. But much more recently than the 1960s, Georgia State was still grossly underperforming, especially for our students of color. So these are our graduation rates, our 6-year bachelor's graduation rates as of 15 years ago. Overall, our graduation rate hovered around 30%, and we were a poster child nationally for the equity gaps. Year after year, semester after semester, the white students were outperforming the students of color. The middle and upper income students were outperforming the low income students. You can set your watch to it. And what makes Georgia State's story hopefully helpful for your purposes, maybe a bit inspirational, is that on the surface, the sorts of things that have happened at Georgia State over the last 15 years, since these numbers were locked in, would not immediately suggest that Georgia State would be the site of a turnaround. For one thing, we've been going through significant demographic changes at Georgia State. When I arrived here as a junior faculty member, I was right out of my PhD program in the late 1980s. This was a majority white campus as far as the student body. Over 70% of the students were white. We became an MSI, minority-serving institution, over a decade ago, and every year since, as you can see, we've become more and more diverse. There's no majority population any longer at Georgia State. Our largest single group now are African-American students, about 39%. We've also gone through another demographic change, which is, to put it bluntly, our students have gotten a lot less well-resourced financially. So the recession hit Atlanta really hard. There was one point during the recession where among all metro areas in the U.S., Atlanta simultaneously had the highest unemployment rate and the highest default rate on home mortgages. And when those kind of economic downturns occur, they don't distribute evenly across the population. Now, the families that send their sons and daughters to Georgia Tech and the University of Georgia, we know from the demographics, tend to be upper middle income and upper income families. And while they might have suffered hardships during the recession, they doubtlessly did, they were not predominantly the families losing their homes and losing their jobs. Those were the families that sent their sons and daughters to Georgia State. And over a 3-4 year period at the start of the recession, we literally doubled the number of Pell students we enrolled at Georgia State. We moved from under a third of our students as Pell eligible to now, as you can see, almost 60%. And to put that into some kind of perspective, this spring semester at Georgia State, we're enrolling 28,900 Pell students. 28,900 Pell students. The entire Ivy League combined this spring is enrolling about 9,800. So we're trying to educate 3 times the number of low-income students as the entire Ivy League. It's not going to be business as usual. And one other point that is going to kind of be a recurring theme in my comments over the next few minutes It's also not the opportunity to create a program. In higher education, we have a problem. What we love to do is create a program. Here's an initiative for our low-income students and for our first-generation students and for our African-American males. And you can do that when you have a defined and limited population. Up the street at Georgia Tech, every summer, they have a bridge program for their incoming Pell students. But they enroll a couple hundred Pell students every summer. They can have a program for those students. But at Georgia State, and that's been the most distinctive trait about what Georgia State has done over the last decade, not creating individual so-called boutique programs, but changing the way we serve all of our students. A couple other details before I get into a couple of these interventions. One is that we have not been getting more selective at Georgia State. Our SAT scores are actually down by over 30 points over the time period we're talking about this afternoon. Usually somebody who's the head of enrollment, as I am, at a big institution would not brag about these points, but this was designed. We decided to broaden our admissions criteria over this time period and support students who in the past were getting into the University of Georgia Tech, and the University of Georgia and Georgia Tech, but who are no longer admissible there. I mean, the average SAT scores for incoming freshmen at Georgia Tech this past fall were above a 1450. So you have to be in the top 1% of U.S. test takers on the SAT to have an average chance of getting into Georgia Tech. What Georgia State has done over the last decade is grow to try to respond to the demand of students who in the past might have been getting into those other institutions. And of course, we're not doing this with more resources because of the recession. We've lost about $40 million in state appropriations. And under these circumstances, it's really easy to point fingers, like, we're going to raise our graduation rates at Georgia State when K through 12 starts producing better prepared students. Or we're going to raise our graduation rates when the state starts funding us at an appropriate level and stops slashing our appropriations every year. But what we did a decade ago at Georgia State, which was initially uncomfortable and then somewhat liberating, was ask a very different question. The simple question, are we the problem? If 7 out of 10 students were coming to Georgia State dropping out with nothing to show for it, whose fault is it? Yeah, it would be better if K through 12 prepared them better, and it would be nice if we had more money. But surely there are some things that we are doing as an institution that are contributing to the fact that the vast majority of students are not succeeding, are not getting the degrees that we promised to deliver to them. And so we began to invest in data, as you're going to hear, data teams, data intelligence, but we directed that data on ourselves. We directed it to try to unearth problems that we were creating by our own practices, by our own policies. And then we used the data to create interventions, and when we found something that worked, we scaled these interventions up, not for one subgroup of our student body, but across the whole population. What I'm going to have the time to do this afternoon is share with you 3 examples, and hopefully this will lead to a richer conversation. But the first example is this. This is one of the embarrassing things we saw in our own data. As recently as about 4 years ago, we were losing 19% of our confirmed incoming freshman class who never showed up for the first day of fall classes. This is the problem known nationally as summer melt. This is not the same as an institution admitting students who end up going elsewhere. This is much more insidious. This is an institution admitting students who say, yes, I want to accept that invitation. They come to orientation, they sign up for classes, they just never show up for classes once the fall semester begins. Almost 20% of our incoming freshman class. So we used the data to analyze this group. Who were these students who had said that they were going to come, put down deposits, signed up for classes, never showed up? Well, this is what we found. 12 months after the start of fall 2015 classes, there were almost 300 students who we had admitted and were registered for our classes at Georgia State who hadn't attended a single day of post-secondary work anywhere across the United States. We tracked them using National Student Clearinghouse data. And look at the profile of these students. Mostly non-white, mostly low-income, really good prospects for graduating from college because they're finishing high school with B+ GPAs. But something is happening during the 3 or 4 months between finishing high school and starting college that's causing these students to change their mind. And when we talk about the origins of the equity gaps, here's an early glimpse of it. Even before the first day of college, we are already weeding out some of the most underserved, the most vulnerable of our students. They're never even making it to the first day of classes. So what is that something that happens in those 4 months between finishing high school and starting college that causes these students to change their mind? Well, the simple answer we came up with is us. Us at Georgia State, us in higher education. We did a census, an analysis of all the bureaucratic steps we expect students to complete in those months between finishing high school and starting college. A time, mind you, when they're no longer in contact with their high school teachers or counselors because they've graduated. They're not yet on our university campuses. Embarrassingly, we found there are about 14 things that we expect students to do. Things like completing the FAFSA, I'm sure you're all familiar with that. We've gotten a lot more familiar with the verification process. Just like the IRS runs algorithms to select certain tax returns for audits, so too the Department of Education runs algorithms to select certain of the FAFSAs once they've been submitted for what they call verification, additional documentation. Unlike the IRS, which audits about 1% or under 1% of U.S. tax returns, this past fall at Georgia State, 34% of our students were selected for verification. So even after the students get through the hurdle of getting their FAFSA in, there's going to be over a third of them who get a follow-up request like the following. In the middle of July, there'll be a note from the federal government that says, oh, we see on your FAFSA you list your grandmother as your legal guardian and assert that your parents are not contributing to your college expenses. Please provide written verification of your grandmother's status. Well, we all know how this works in low-income families. They're not going to lawyers to move guardianship from one person to another. Mom and dad are gone, grandma takes over. The student gets this note from the federal government and says, well, I don't have any verification of my grandmother legal guardian status. I know she doesn't either. And the federal government's saying, I need that in order to get my federal aid. I guess I'm not going to college after all. The state of Georgia has immunization requirements. And at this time, among any other, I certainly wouldn't criticize having immunization requirements, but I will report that they distribute inequitably across the student population, right? The middle and upper income students don't have any trouble satisfying that requirement. And it's not because the students are any smarter or more enabled. It's they give big requests to their parents, and their parents send their records in. But if you're that same student we were just referring to, being raised by your grandmother, again, you say, well, I don't have any immunization records. I know my grandmother doesn't either. And Georgia State's saying I need to bring those records in before I can register for classes. Guess I'm not going to college after all. Each one of these steps not only weeds out some students, but it disproportionately weeds out students from low-income backgrounds. So for the summer of 2016, the next cycle, we made some simple and low-cost changes to the way we onboard our students. One thing we did is created a portal. The portal sign on to this, the students sign on to this site, and it takes them through those 14 steps they need to complete. It's color-coded, so as they complete a step, it changes color. There are tools and resources there. I'll tell you the biggest advantage since we launched the portal is that as an administrator, I, for the first time, have good data on specifically what is tripping up our students. I used to know our student was engaged and then they stopped engaging us. Now I know a student is engaged up until the point, say, we ask for their immunization records, and then we stop hearing from them. So we can reach out with much more specific help for that student. And because of collecting this data, we've changed practices at Georgia State in significant ways. I'm proud to say that this summer, we offer about 40 orientations over the course of the summer for the incoming freshmen. Students come in groups of 250 at a time, register for classes, get oriented, and so forth. This summer, for the first time, we contracted with a local health clinic. It parked outside every one of those 40 orientations, and it provided free immunizations to the students. You know, it doesn't do a low-income student any good to send them back to their hometown saying, well, go find a way to get immunized for measles. What we've done is take that step away, and from an ROI perspective, it's costing us about $50 a student for those immunizations, but in many cases, that means the difference between these students walking away from college entirely and being enrolled for hopefully 4 or 5 years until they get their bachelor's degree. The second thing we did, and this one has gotten more attention nationally, is we became one of the first schools in the country to launch an AI-enhanced chatbot for student success purposes. So what's a chatbot? It's just an automatic texting platform. What we did is we built up a knowledge base of over 2,000 text-based answers to questions commonly asked by our incoming students. Questions about financial aid and registration and verification and immunization records and all these other issues. We work with a tech partner, a company called AdmitHub, to take these 2,000 text responses and put them on a smart device. It's not an app. Students just go onto the regular texting platform and begin a conversation with Pounce. You're looking at Pounce right there. That's our school mascot, the panther. And they can, once they begin the conversation, 24/7, go onto their texting platform on their device and text a question. If the answer is in the knowledge base, what happens, what the AI does is uses algorithms to locate the right answer and pull it out immediately for the students. If the answer is not in the knowledge base, the AI makes that determination and instead delivers the question to a staff person who writes the answer, adds it to the knowledge base, so the knowledge base is constantly growing and getting smarter. In a very simple sense, this is no different than the kind of FAQs all of us have had on websites for the last 15 years. Here's a student asking about parking on campus, and depending on whether they're going to park every day or only come occasionally, they get a different response. But what the AI is able to do in real language and real time is an exponential increase in the power of this kind of tool. This is the actual mapping of what our current chatbot looks like with regard to a student who has a question about completing the FAFSA. And depending upon the student's response, are they a dependent student or not, are they Pell eligible or not, are they taking out loans, are they living at home, and so forth, they get a whole different series of answers. And the next follow-up question, so that at times the students are sitting there for 15 and 20 different conversation points with Pounce in a single sitting. When we launched this AI-enhanced chatbot in June 2016, we thought we might have 5,000 to 6,000 questions answered for our students in the 3 or 4 months before the start of fall classes. In those 3 or 4 months alone, just for incoming freshmen, we had over 180,000 questions answered. Average response time was about 6 seconds. And what we saw in the data was very revealing. One thing we saw is that the use of the chatbot that first summer, and it remains true to this day, it's higher at 1 a.m. than at 9 a.m. So we're used to our business practices. At Georgia State, we open all our offices up at 8:30 in the morning. That's not when the students are asking the questions. They're up asking the questions when most of our offices are closed. But Pounce is there, available to answer the questions whenever. More soberly, we did focus groups with the students after that first summer. We asked them what their experience was, what they liked and didn't like. The most moving thing we heard is a number of students admitted to us they asked the chatbot questions they wouldn't have asked a human being. You know, if you can't get your biological father to sign the FAFSA because you haven't seen him for the last 2 years, the last thing you want is to go into some stranger's office and spill out your family's personal history to that person. The students liked the fact that they knew it was a chatbot. They liked the fact that it was a bot put in their hands to help them solve the problem themselves. No judgment, no embarrassment, and it made a difference. What kind of difference did these simple changes to the way we onboard students make? Well, in the 3 summers we've had these new tools in place, we've reduced summer melt at Georgia State by 37%. Given the size of our incoming freshman class, that translates into over 350 students who are in their seats ready to go the first day of class, who were sitting out college entirely just a few years ago. And because it's worked so well for our incoming freshmen, what we've done over the last 12 months is extend the use of the chatbot for all of our enrolled students. The questions obviously don't stop once the first day of classes begin. So we have students, now 21,000 students this spring are using our chatbot on a day-to-day basis. And we're running random control trials with independent evaluators. We're seeing significant gains in students completing key tasks like removing balances from their accounts, solving holds, coming to see advisors. We're not seeing gains for the students on the chatbot of 5 or 10%, but as you can see, in some cases by 30, 40, close to 50% better response rates. My second example for you this afternoon, 1,000. 1,000 was the number of fully registered and qualified students who we were dropping from our courses every semester because they couldn't come up with the payments to cover their tuition and fees. These are the last students you want to drop. They've succeeded academically, they want to be there, they're motivated, but we're eliminating them from further progression because they can't cover the cost of their tuition and fees. So again, we took a look at the data, and the most interesting thing we saw about the students we were dropping every semester for non-payment is the largest subgroup of these students were seniors. Students who, by definition, were within a semester or 2 or graduating. Why seniors? Well, typically in retention work, freshmen are much higher risk than sophomores, than juniors, than seniors, and so forth. As students progress, they become less of a risk for dropping out, unless we're talking about low-income students. The challenge with low-income students is these are the students running out of eligibility for their aid. The biggest scholarship in the state of Georgia, state scholarship, is the Hope Scholarship. It covers 4 years. Our students live complicated lives. As you now know, most of them are low income. 85% of them are working jobs at the same time they're taking classes. If one semester they had to withdraw from classes because of a family or work obligation, they're going to run out of the Hope Scholarship just before they complete. A number of these students were on track, and a number of these students didn't owe us thousands and thousands of dollars. It was seen radical at the time. We call it Panther Retention Grants. The key here is students do nothing. We don't ask them to self-identify. We don't ask them to come into an office and fill out a form. We are just looking at our data for students who are close to graduating, at risk of being dropped for financial reasons. And right before we would otherwise drop them for the semester, we instead put the money in their account, up to $1,500. Call the students up, let them know, don't make other plans Monday morning, because we covered the last $300 or $800 or $1,200 on your balance for the semester. You're good to go. The first semesters we ran this program, we had multiple students hanging up on us. They thought it was a scam. I believe anybody from Georgia State had just put this money in their accounts. But if you think about it, what is a more efficient way of using institutional aid? Well, I'm a big fan of freshman year scholarships, but there we're often pledging thousands of dollars to students who have no track record in college. Here we have students who are in their senior years. They've shown they can do college work. They're not all A students. Some of the students getting these grants are C students. But they've shown that they have persistence and grit, and they can do college work. And if we can give them just a little bit, you can see here the average grant is $900. We're getting about 87% of these students to complete their college degree within a couple semesters. Our data shows if these students are allowed to drop out or stop out for financial reasons, so involuntarily get dropped for the semester because they can't cover their cost of their tuition and fees, the chances of them coming back and completing their degree are only about 30%. Because this has worked so well, we've scaled it up immensely. Over the last couple years, we now are giving more than 2,000 of these grants out a year. We have over 17,000 of these grants we've awarded since the founding of the program. You may ask how we can afford to do that. The Gates Foundation asked the same question, and the answer was heartening. They looked at 6 years of our data for this program, came away with the conclusion, and it's a published report now, that this program generates more revenue than it costs us. We give each student on average $900. We immediately get the $900 back because it just covers the balance they owe the university. But the average student who's gotten one of these grants over the last 7 years has had a balance for that semester of closer to $2,800. So they've already paid down their balance out of loans and out of pocket. By giving them the $900, we not only get the $900 back again, we recover the additional $1,800 that otherwise would be wiped away and benefit no one. And so this is the rare instance, you're doing the right thing morally, you're also doing the self-interested thing from, a budget and institutional perspective. The third and final example I'm going to share with you, and we will leave time for comments and questions, is probably the biggest one and the one that Georgia State is most noted for. We had about 5,700 students a year dropping out of Georgia State. This is different from the previous group. The previous group were not dropping out, right? We were dropping them. They wanted to be registered and were signed up for classes but couldn't pay for them. This is the group, kind of the silent group, that's just enrolled one semester and not the next. And they never really explain why. You reach out to them, try to get them to come back, send them emails. After a year, you have to kind of write them off as dropouts. So back in 2012, we engaged in a big data project. We used 10 years of our data, 140,000 student records, 2.5 million grades. What we were trying to do is very simple. Could we identify in our historical record any recurring student behaviors that correlated in a statistically significant ways to students dropping or flunking out of the university? What do students do 6 months or 12 months or 2 years before they drop out that might give us an early warning? We thought we'd find a couple dozen behaviors that were statistically significant. We actually found there were 800. And so what Georgia State has been doing for 7.5 years now is every single night, as we update all our data systems, we're looking for any of these 800 behaviors. If one is identified, the next morning, the staff person assigned to that particular student, the advisor assigned to that person, that student, gets an alert, and they have 48 hours for an intervention. So there's going to be an immediate attention to whatever problem was identified. For the most part, we're just identifying common sense sort of things. We have these complicated maps. This is what a student needs to do to complete a BS in chemistry. We've never been monitoring whether the student was adhering to the map appropriately or not before the first day of each semester. Now we're looking at every registration record to make sure students are in the right classes. This spring semester alone, we found over 3,000 instances at Georgia State where students were signed up for the wrong course. They were taking courses out of order, or they were signed up for the wrong version of the course that would get them no closer to graduation. In the past, most of those 3,000 students would have been allowed to pay for and take the wrong class. Now, we have an alert go off as soon as they register for that course, and they get an intervention, and they're in the right class before the semester begins. The predictive analytics on which the platform is based look like this. One of the simple things we found is a strong correlation between the first grade a student gets in his or her major and their chances of graduating on time. So we run these data for every major at Georgia State, but just as an example, if you look at the center of the screen, these are our political science majors. What this chart shows is if a political science major gets an A or B in their first political science course, they're graduating from Georgia State on time at about a 75% clip, which is great for us. They get a C in that first class, they're graduating on time at a 25% clip. But we had never done anything with that C student before, at least prior to this new approach 7 years ago. You know, we passed the C student along to upper level coursework, and inevitably by the data, at least 75% of these students would start to struggle. And after they collected enough D's and F's, somebody would intervene. Now we intervene at the first sign of the C grade. The advisor will sit down with the student, look at the papers and exams. Maybe there are reading and writing issues that need to be addressed. Maybe it's just that the student is working 40 hours a week, but why don't we diagnose the problem now instead of sitting back passively and waiting for the student to dig him or herself into a much deeper hole? The trick with this approach to predictive analytics and advising is to do it at scale. And over the last 12 months alone, we've had over 60,000 one-on-one meetings between our advisors and students that were prompted by alerts coming out of this platform. We didn't correct all 60,000 problems, but I can say 7 years ago, we were leaving these 60,000 problems completely undiagnosed, right? Students were signing up for the wrong classes, they were underperforming in prerequisites, nobody was lifting a finger. We were expecting our mostly first-generation low-income student body to have diagnostic powers that we ourselves didn't have. And we've finally taken some responsibilities to helping students navigate the big, academic bureaucracy that we've created. Did this intervention make a difference? It made a big difference. We launched in 2012. We immediately saw significant improvements in overall progression rates. The biggest gains were for our non-traditional students. Our military learners, our adult learners, our part-time students. They're getting tracked for 800 different risk factors and immediate interventions, and it's making a big difference. Another big difference that has occurred is students are taking far less time to complete their degree requirements. We haven't lowered or eliminated a single degree requirement from Georgia State, but the average bachelor student is now taking half a semester less time to complete those requirements because they're in the right courses, in the right order, and they're getting, if they go off path, they're getting back on path much more quickly. And this drop of an average of over a half a semester in the time it takes a Georgia State student to complete a bachelor's degree translates into big money in the pockets of our students and their families. This most recent graduating class of 2019 saved $18 million in tuition and fees just by the fact that they graduated more quickly compared to the graduating class of 2012, the year before we launched this intervention. And maybe the most surprising impact of our proactive use of analytics and advising is this, that some of our faculty feared what we were doing was, as they put it, creating a system for moving students to easier majors. If we advise students by probabilities, they'll all end up taking the easiest courses and the easiest majors. Well, Georgia State may be the best test case for this approach nationally because we've been doing it for over 7 years. We've had over 500,000 interventions with our students in aggregate. And over that time, our two fastest growing majors are computer science and biology. Nobody thinks those are among our easiest majors at Georgia State. Every year since we've had this new system in place, we've set new records for the number of STEM majors we're graduating. And here are some demographic groups nationally that struggle in STEM fields, and we're seeing exponential increases in bachelor's degrees awarded in STEM fields to these populations. When we looked at our data, it's not because we've had a big increase in the number of students declaring STEM majors. That's remained quite flat. In fact, the biggest difference is we have had a huge drop in students declaring STEM majors and flunking out or wiping out after their first 12 months. We used to be happy to let some low-income first-generation students say they were pre-med, and we would sit back passively while they struggled in calculus and organic chemistry and so forth. Now we have alerts going off as early as 3 and 4 weeks into the semester, and we're getting students help, tutoring, and otherwise quickly. And what might have been a D on the midterm, maybe it's a B-. By the end of the semester, maybe they pull it up to a B+, and they're ready to go for the next semester. So in conclusion, I'm going to talk about a couple aggregate impacts. What happens when you put these kind of changes together at scale. One of the changes we weren't anticipating is it's changed the reputation and the identity of the university. This was campus a couple of years ago. You'll recognize the gentleman on the far right there. When Bill Gates came to visit, the most interesting fact is we did not invite him. He invited himself. He was coming to Atlanta to do a keynote address on world health at the big convention center. A few weeks beforehand, his people contact us and say, well, Bill's coming to town, and he's been reading about all you're doing with data and technology to help low-income students. Would you mind if he dropped by for a couple hours to learn more about what you're doing? And we allowed it just this one time. But he was serious. He didn't want to meet the president. He didn't meet the president or anything. He came and we went to a back door. We had a room set up with the technology, with some of our first-generation students. He spent 2.5 hours learning about what we were doing. And that's good for the identity of a campus, especially one with a kind of spotty moral history, that we're identified for good things. I've had the honor now of speaking twice at the White House. President Obama cited our Panther Retention Grant Program as a national model. But this isn't a partisan issue. I also had the honor of testifying before the U.S. Senate. And there, the invitation came from the Republican side of the aisle. Senator Lamar Alexander was the one who invited me to talk to his committee about the kind of issues we're doing. That's important in these divisive political times to realize that whether you're all about social justice and equity or all about workforce and tax base and so forth, the answer is the same. We need to do a much better job of educating, especially people coming from low-income backgrounds. A second major change that has occurred is that it's changed the financial footing of Georgia State University. Every 1 point we improve our progression rates at Georgia State, it's worth about $3 million a year in additional tuition and fee revenues. Well, we haven't improved our progression and retention rates 1 point over the time period I've been describing this afternoon. We've actually improved them 23 percentage points. So we're talking about over the course of a decade an improvement in of $60 to $70 million of revenues coming into the university on an annual basis, especially as we look at the demographics ahead and the Midwest is facing even steeper challenges than we are here in Georgia. We need to hold on to the students that currently enroll rather than being cavalier about seeing 50, 60, 70% of them walking away without a credential. The third and final result, and this is the one that was our main motivating factor, is that we are now graduating over 3,000 more students a year from Georgia State than we were less than a decade ago. I'll repeat that, over 3,000 more students every year, a 73% increase. And when you look at where these student gains have come from, they've come disproportionately from the students who struggled the most beforehand. Every demographic group is doing better, our upper income, our white students, and so forth. But as you can see, we're up 73% overall in bachelor's degrees awarded, but over 120% for our African American students, almost 190% for our Hispanic and our low-income students. Not because any one of our interventions is targeted by race, ethnicity, or income level. In each case, we found a problem, we identified the problem, worked on a solution, or at least a mitigation, and when we found something that was effective, we scaled it up across the whole student body. What happened is the students who were struggling the most before were the students who most benefited from that intervention. The graduation rates we started with just a few minutes ago, those were the blue bars we were looking at where our graduation rates were 30%. They have not improved incrementally, they've improved exponentially. We've more than doubled our graduation rate for our African American students. We've tripled our graduation rate for African American males. We've almost tripled our graduation rate for our Hispanic students now. And for 5 years in a row at Georgia State University, our Hispanic, our African American, and our Pell students have all graduated at or above the rate of the student body overall. So race, ethnicity, income level no longer predicts who is most likely to graduate from Georgia State. And this campus in the shadow of the Martin Luther King district that was segregated into the 1960s and grossly underperforming for our students of color as recently as a decade ago, now, and it's been for 6 years in a row, confers more bachelor's degrees to African American students than any other college in the United States. And isn't that a more fitting legacy to the Reverend King? So my final comments are, I'm going to anticipate 2 questions that I hear all the time. And so I want to put some data in front of you to answer these questions before we open things up. One question is, yeah, you're graduating a lot more students, but are you just a diploma mill? Are these students actually learning anything, and are they succeeding after graduation? And the news here is very good. The frank reality is the average Georgia State graduate does not earn as much as the average Georgia Tech graduate. Most of those students come from upper income backgrounds, and they're almost exclusively going into technology and science careers. Georgia State, on the other hand, is the largest producer of teachers and social workers in the state of Georgia, and as you now know, most of our students come from low income backgrounds. But by the marker of social mobility, how effective is a campus in taking students as they first enroll and then moving them to higher income brackets after graduation? Georgia State does very well indeed. The Brookings Institute that uses data that's from Harvard researcher Raj Chetty, he's asking the question of, for students who start college from the bottom 20% of Americans by annual household income, how effective is a campus in moving students to the upper half of Americans by annual household income 15 years after first matriculation? Out of over 2,000 universities that Raj Chetty and the Brookings Institute looked at, Georgia State finished number 25. The other question I get is, yeah, it worked at Georgia State, but will it work elsewhere? And we've had good success of partnering with a number of schools nationally, Morgan State, Tennessee State, Indian River out of Florida, and getting some of these same sorts of results. But the state of Georgia gave us a great test case a little over 3 years ago, because I mentioned they combined us with the largest community college in the state of Georgia. This was an open access institution, 20,000 students or thereabouts, that was performing at very low levels. When consolidation was announced, the 3-year graduation rate for associate degrees from Perimeter College was 6.5%. What we've been doing in the 3+ years since then is rolling out some of the same programs I'm describing to you this afternoon. And you can see the results. We're not where we want to be or need to be yet, but we have already tripled the graduation rate for this particular community college. And just very recently, the Chronicle of Higher Education released a new ranking. It was, how does a community college do, not just in graduating students, because for many students who go to community colleges, that's not their main goal. They want to transfer to a 4-year institution. So how effective is an institution in either graduating the student with an associate's degree within 3 years and or landing them successfully in a 4-year program? And by that ranking, out of over 800 institutions looked at, Perimeter College is already number 20 in the nation, with 83% of the students succeeding by that metric. So the story of Georgia State is one about individual interventions and the use of data. I think there are lots of lessons to be learned from that, and lots of things we can share. For instance, I'd be happy to share our knowledge base that we use as the basis for our chatbot with you. We developed it, and we have the right to share it with you. But one last thought, and it's an important one, that I think the most important lesson of Georgia State is that we have a lot more power in our hands than we give ourselves credit for. That a lot of us have been a product of a generation of education scholarship that convincingly traces the origins of equity gaps, achievement gaps, to 8th grade math scores, 3rd grade reading scores, even pre-K. And I'm not disputing the accuracy of these studies, that there have been verified evidence that equity gaps begin very early. But I think some of us, and I was one of them, wrongly concluded from those studies that because these gaps occur so early, there's not much we can do to make a difference. And what Georgia State shows resoundingly is for those who think that the equity gaps are written in stone and there's nothing we can do about them by the time the students enroll in our institutions, that's a lie. We have a lot more power, and as a result of that, we have a lot more responsibility. So thank you for your attention, and thank you very much for the work you do on behalf of all the students in Indiana.
I think we got Can you hear us? No. What? Oh. Good idea. Can you hear us?
Barely. I might need somebody to read the question into the laptop.
What's that?
She's going to talk to you.
You're going to talk.
No, you're going to say the question. She's going to repeat.
Okay. Well, anyway, this is Al Hubbard. I'm currently the chairman for a few more months of the commission. And I'm just blown away. I've been hearing so many wonderful things, and I'm even more impressed. And it's interesting to me that it's so analytically driven, which is remarkable because you can measure exactly what's working and what's not working. And I know we've got a lot of questions, so I will open it up to our other members of the commission. Mike Alley.
what Georgia State is suggesting is a different business model for higher education. That it may not work for the very most elite institutions. If you're Harvard or Michigan and your graduation rates are already 95, 98%, there may not be a lot of revenue to be gained. But if your graduation rate is like Georgia State's was, 30%, or 50%, or even 70%, there is a lot of revenue to be gained from moving that needle another 10 percentage points, another 15 percentage points, or as we've done, another 20 percentage points. So we have a very forward-looking president, Mark Becker, and a very forward-looking CFO. And what they did early on in our efforts, and this was close to 10 years ago, is say, there will be additional revenue for every point that you move the success rates of our students. There'll be additional revenue coming in. What we're going to do is bounce back 10% of those additional revenues to the student success division. And it's not going to be earmarked. You can do what you want with the money. You've shown over the past 12 months, if you can move the needle in a positive way, you know what you're doing, and we're going to trust you. The result is that it's allowed us to be a lot more innovative. For instance, the chatbot I described early on, that was not done because I went to any office at Georgia State or even the president and said, oh, we need to launch a chatbot, please give me resources and so forth. We were able to launch that out of the additional revenues we had coming in from raising graduation rates and success rates the year before. But the first time the president and the administration really heard about this in a public way was after the first summer, where I was able to present the positive results that were coming in from the additional students we were holding on to. We started all of this work 10 years ago with a student-to-advisor ratio that was close to 1,000 to 1, which is completely untenable, especially when you enroll the kind of students, Georgia State students who need help and need advice and so forth. And we've gotten that ratio down to about 350 to 1. And again, that's mostly been through reinvesting the kind of resources that can be gained through increased success with your students.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. Congratulations and thanks so much for all your great work and informing us as well. I can say that may be one of the best presentations in any subject that I've heard in a long, long time. Very compelling and really want to thank you. So my question is, and you kind of alluded to this, but what were some of the big key naysayers or roadblocks that you had to overcome to actually prove out what you've been able to prove out?
Yeah, a great question. And I'm a faculty member, so I'll kind of say this from an autobiographical perspective. Faculty are a tough audience. They're very smart, they're trained, and they think they know a lot about this space because they're in the classroom every day. And so they have very strong intuitions about what works and what doesn't work. So we were quite aware that we needed to build faculty buy-in intentionally. And I'll mention a couple of things we did. One that was very evident from the presentation is we use the data. That's not just a good tool. I mean, it's finally the case that institutions should live up to what we teach our students, which is follow the scientific method and use evidence and so forth. Too often we don't follow that ourselves. So we use the data because it's a very good icebreaker with working with faculty. Faculty come from all different backgrounds, but almost all the faculty coming out of their graduate programs are trained to respect the evidence. So if you lead with the evidence, that can be really compelling. A second thing we did quite intentionally is we work with a number of independent evaluators. So I alluded to this in passing, but the reality is many of the interventions we launch at the same time we're working with somebody who's going to do a careful analysis of the impact. Most of these impacts are available on the website you see on the screen right now, success.gsu.edu. You can convince faculty all the more so by making sure that the data is treated in a certain way and respected in a certain way. And for instance, when we launched the chatbot, we used a researcher out of the University of Pittsburgh, who's a national leader in studying summer melt. And when she published her findings, which is about 6 months after the experiment, she published them in the Harvard Business Review. That had been a very effective way of getting faculty and other stakeholders to buy in when they're seeing the intervention being extolled in the Harvard Business Review. The third and final point I'll make is, just as I said, we launched all of these initiatives by asking the question, are we the problem? We did that at the macro level for the whole university to be thinking about, the ways we're the problem. But as we launched these efforts, we started with a more micro version of that question. Are we the problem, meaning are we the administration the problem? So look at the 3 examples I gave you, talking about summer melt and the way we support students before they get to the first day of class, talking about the way we distribute institutional financial aid, the micro grants, the Panther retention grants, and talking about tracking students in academic advising and proactive interventions. All of those are administrative functions. And so we wanted our faculty to recognize this was not an opportunity for us to say, the problem is you need to change. Instead, we said, and we proved that we were a big part of the problem, that our administrative functions were a big part of the problem. Now, if I had another 20, 30 minutes, I would have gone into some of the ways since then the faculty have gotten engaged. And there have been all kinds of ways once the faculty saw this model being used, they began to say, we can approach our own discipline in our own academic areas in the same fashion. Our nursing program, our business program have totally changed the way they structure the sequencing of courses and requirements, in part from the data coming out of these platforms. Because if 3 weeks into the semester, 30% of the introduction to accounting students are failing, and you share that data openly with the business school, then the business school might just say, well, maybe we're creating a problem. We need to change that first module in the accounting course so that more students grasp the material. And that's just what's happened again and again at Georgia State. But we didn't lead with that. We led with the administration is a big part of the problem.
I have a question. Yeah, maybe you can hear me. So I had to go out for a couple minutes, so I hope you haven't already answered this. That I don't want you to have to repeat yourself, but you obviously, over the last 10 years, have driven huge change. How did you do, universities are known as very difficult institutions to change, and it's unclear who's in charge. And so I would love to hear about, I assume you have been, talking to Teresa, you've been the catalyst, and how did you do it? Has it been with more than one university president? And how did you push the university to make these kind of changes?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've been very fortunate to have predominantly one president. Technically, all this work was done under 2, but one president for the vast majority of this time, who is very bold and very well respected nationally, and I'm so sure Teresa and others know of Mark Becker and some of his work. So that's been a huge, huge advantage. But the other thing I'll say is, I came out of the faculty. I was a tenured faculty member before I started this. I chaired one of the largest Senate committees. I chaired our academic programs committee before I began this work. I'm not saying that formula necessarily translates in all instances, but I think it's helpful to have some insiders, and I think it's helpful to have this led from the faculty side of things, so that the faculty will be a little more willing and more embracing and so forth. As I just finished saying, I think it helps to be very intentional about the way you collect evidence, because that matters more in an academic context than in most other contexts. I think it's important to have a communication plan. So I appreciate the very nice comment about the presentation, but it's really important that this not be the exception, that we find a way to articulate to our faculty, to our staff, to our representatives, our state representatives and so forth, the importance of these issues and what's possible. Because if we don't do so, then people are going to take the view that here's another administrator coming along with another set of empty promises, and I'll just sit it out and wait 3 or 4 years until the next person comes along. What we've been able to do by showing the moving of the needle, and that's one reason I even mentioned Bill Gates and so forth, is that's all part of a process of changing mindset of our students, our staff, and our faculty to say, we can do something that is transformative, that is different. And I'll say something very encouraging, which is absolutely true of most of your institutions as well. Most people are not attracted to higher education for the money, right? These very smart people with very high degrees could probably have taken a path that would have earned them a more secure and a higher, paycheck every month. They do it because they really care about students. They really believe in the transformative impact of education. And what we need to do as leaders in higher education is give our stakeholders cause to believe. And to put it bluntly, to believe in us. To believe that the reason they came to make a difference in the lives of students is still possible. People become dead over time. If I showed you the graduation rates at Georgia State the 10 years before these changes were enacted, where all of a sudden there have been exponential increases, they would have been flat. We were at 30%, 28%, 31%, 29%, year after year after year. And if you're a faculty member or a staff person working hard over that time period, you think, well, what's it all for? I killed myself, I changed my processes, I did this differently, and nothing moved. So we need to make changes that show people that they can make a difference, that we can collectively make a difference. And if there's any simple formula to what Georgia State has done, I think that's been the most important thing, is get all those people who want to believe that they can make a difference to understand that they really can. And then there becomes a cumulative and an aggregate impact.
I'm just have one follow-up, and then I'll turn and get some other questions. But given your remarkable success, you would think other universities would be lining up to embrace your approach. Has that in fact happened, and have there been some significant successes with other universities with a similar population?
I will say, first off, we've had over the last 3 years over 500 campuses from mostly in the United States, but across the world, New Zealand, South Africa, Korea, come to Georgia State, bring teams to study with us and learn about what we're doing. So that's encouraging in and of itself. As there have been some public coverage, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, others have covered this story. People want to learn. There is that desire. Now, not all the 500 have gone back and made changes that are substantive. So it's clear that just hearing about it's not enough, although that may be a necessary stage. Then you need to have the right formula on campus. But many campuses do. And so I alluded to a couple of the campuses that have changed. The reason I mentioned a little earlier, Oregon State, which is an HBCU out of Baltimore, Middle Tennessee State, and Indian River, is those are 3 campuses that came to visit us several years ago. We sent multiple teams, follow-ups. I visited these campuses. They've studied us, we've studied them. We've shared documents, knowledge base, training manuals, and so forth. And each one of those campuses over the last 18 months has won a national award for improvement in their graduation rates. Indian River just won the Aspen Prize. Both Oregon State and Middle Tennessee State won awards from the APLU for having among the fastest improving graduation rates in the country. I will say that we've done a better job of propagating this model across the state of Georgia, and there was just a press release, you can Google it, a couple days ago from the university system, where our statewide graduation rates across all 26 institutions are up remarkably over the last 6-7 years. One of the biggest increases, I think we're now in the top 5 states in the country for fastest improving graduation rates. And it's not that every campus invested and adopted these approaches. In fact, the latest count is, as far as predictive analytics and advising, there are 14 of the 26 institutions that have adopted it. But with any of these gains we're talking about, whether it's institutionally or statewide, we're not talking about perfection, right? Nothing we've done at Georgia State has turned our graduation rate to 100%. Nothing you will do across the state of state of Indiana, and nothing we've done across the state of Georgia will create, 100% compliance, 100% buy-in. But if you can begin to create a context where 14 out of 26 schools are doing something substantive that they weren't doing, 4 or 5 years ago, then you begin to see these significant improvements. And that's just what's going on. And hopefully, that's also creating the pressure and the incentive for those other, 12 institutions to come along and say, maybe we better get on board as well.
Other questions? Yeah, Teresa.
Yeah, this is Teresa. Obviously, we've talked about how this works at an institutional level, and I think that the buy-in of the faculty and the way that you described the role of this makes sense. In thinking about the role of a state coordinating board or a board of regents, which is a little different, and how you could drive an agenda, especially an agenda around equity, how much of what could you not, let me ask this a different way. You scaled it at one institution. How can we, with a sense of urgency, scale this in a bigger way at a state level?
Yeah, I mean, that is the big question and the big challenge. I will say this, that part of what makes the Georgia State model attractive, and one of the reasons why we have already scaled across multiple institutions in the sense that the state brought in this community college and said, do the same thing there that you've been doing at Georgia State, is that the model works from different perspectives. So it works from a student success perspective in significant fashion, improving completion and graduation rates. It also works from a fiscal perspective, right? This is not a high expense model. There are some examples out there. You know, Cooney has a great program with ASAP. But, you know, it's very expensive because every student in that program is getting scholarships and so forth. And New York City is trying to expand that program, but it is, you know, kind of difficult to see how it would scale across the entire state. But what Georgia State is doing is kind of holding on to revenue at the same time it's holding on to students. And that's a very attractive model to states, to presidents, to leadership in the legislature, and so forth. So we need to make it clearer what the potential is, what the gain and what the loss is. You know, one of the things that benefited Georgia State, ironically, we didn't see it at the time, is we were doing all of this work, at least the most groundbreaking work, during a recession. And, you know, times of crisis create opportunities. People expect there are going to have to be new ideas, and people are strained to the point of maybe embracing things that they wouldn't under more complacent times. And, you know, we live under those times right now for two reasons. One is the obvious immediate one with coronavirus, but the other is that we're facing huge challenges over the next decades when it comes to college demographics. You know, most of our states are seeing steep declines in high school graduates and the potential audience for our colleges. So this is the time for states to pick up and say, what can we do to enable and incentivize these various practices? Some of these things are simple. In the case of expanding the predictive analytics we use in advising, one of the things the University System of Georgia did is contract with some of the national vendors for reduced costs by scale. If we can get 5 campuses to join, the cost will go down some, and if we can get 10 to join, it'll go down even further and so forth. So even though the state in Georgia is not paying for the analytics, they have helped negotiate a better cost deal to enable other campuses to embrace that. There are other ways for the state to be involved. I mentioned in passing a few minutes ago that the biggest work with launching our chatbot was the knowledge base, building up this repository of all these answers to questions. We launched with 2,000, but now we're well over 4,000 answers to questions. Well, the reality is, as we launched our chatbot, the majority of the questions that came in were about financial aid. And the nice thing about financial aid answers is that they're same across your state, right? A lot of the questions about federal aid, those are the same across the country. Other questions will be about state programs and state support, and those will be the same across all institutions. So you can share that knowledge base. You could even have, Indiana higher ed chatbot for all those students facing summer melt before they first enroll in college to answer their questions, where you don't have to get every single institution one by one to buy in. And as I said, we are happy at Georgia State, since we have intellectual ownership of our knowledge base, to share it with you, so you can see what kind of questions we've got over the last 4 or so years, what kind of answers we created and so forth. You can take it and borrow it wholesale and decide how to deploy it yourself.
Can I ask
please.
a quick question?
John.
You say you have a ratio of 350 to 1. Is that a staff of about, what, 60 people? 60 faculty, or is it maybe more?
Yeah, the ratio I was talking about was 350 students at Georgia State for every 1 professional advisor that we employ. And that is the model we've been using. We did, prior to a lot of these changes, have a lot of faculty advisors at Georgia State. There too, we made kind of a financial argument. You can get a chemistry professor to advise students. It's not going to be their highest priority. They're not going to be the most expert. Certainly they'll be expert about chemistry, but not expert about university requirements and so forth. And you're paying that person a lot of money to advise students. What we instead have done over the last decade is move from a model that was predominantly driven by faculty advisors to one now that is driven by hiring professional advisors. These are the people who are tracking our students on a day-to-day basis. Most of them are early career, recent graduates. We require that they have at least a bachelor's degree. They come in with enthusiasm. They're often technologically comfortable. But the starting salaries are around $36,000, $37,000 as opposed to tenured faculty member in our STEM fields who are earning 3 times, 4 times that in some instances. So we've moved away from not faculty interacting with students. We still encourage faculty to be mentors, to talk to students about the chemistry major, about graduate school, about fellowships and careers and so forth. But we're not asking our chemistry faculty or any other department faculty to sit there with freshmen and try to guide them through distributive requirements, because that's never been very successful and it's very expensive.
So, would you be willing to share your slides with us?
Absolutely. So, in fact, I've already sent them. Liz has them, so she's welcome to distribute them.
They're online already. Well, thank you so much. Well, let's give another big round of applause. Thank you so much, and congratulations on remarkable accomplishments. And that's just amazing. So, thank you.
Thank you.
We can. So, Liz, can you email us the slides?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Well, that was terrific. So, we have just a few business items. Yes, Dennis, please.
Is there, is there a prospect of them having actually come in person in the future?
Absolutely. We have several ways that we want to talk to him specifically about some of the ideas around chatbot and some other things, but I mean, all of this I think would be helpful. He's been very gracious with his willingness to spend time with us. So, we need to think about what we need to do in the interim so that when we bring him, it's the best, most productive use of his time and ours. But what I hear you saying is you'd be interested in having him come again.
Well, absolutely. I would have them come to the person.
Yeah.
The thing that was going through my mind, Teresa, was how do we share this with the right people with our institutional partners to really get a sense of what they're doing down there and build some enthusiasm to at least go down and take a look at it. Because it could, if they had even half of the same kind of response, it could be millions of dollars in some of these institutions and saved capital. So I don't know, I just think it's somehow, I wonder if we could be a catalyst to figure out who the right person is that may own some of this in each one of our partner institutions, and maybe take a combined trip down there or do something that really raises that as a powerful tool that could be implemented.
Well, if I read this correctly, so his graduation rate is now north of 75. So he would qualify for this new performance funding, and his student population is more comparable to Indiana State's population. Which, I mean, what an opportunity.
Exactly.
That's what an opportunity.
I mean, it's done.
Yeah.
I would just caution, they're all great things, but it is not an easy task to implement and get everybody on board. I mean, it's all about execution. And again, they've done a brilliant job. They've had exceptional leadership, given a lot of ability to innovate, and those things don't happen overnight. But I applaud what they've done, and I think it's a great model that hopefully some of our institutions could grasp and embrace and do. But it'll take some time.
Is the software available at all that they use?
That's a good question. Is the software available that they use? It sounds like to me it is.
Well, that would be a critical element.
Right.
Right. The questions that they have put together and the way that they've done the chatbot, I think they're willing to share some of that with us. I think back to what Dennis said as well, perhaps if we have the opportunity to bring Tim here, we have the opportunity to maybe bring together some of the colleges and universities who might be interested in bringing a group of people together to hear from him as well. And we could do both of those things at the same time. Building on, I mean, there's a lot in place on some of our colleges and universities that naturally build on what he's talking about and could take it. We might be able to help with some of the predictive analytics in the system and pay for some of those kinds of things. You know, I think that there would be reason to bring him back for purposes of talking to us and for purposes of convening a group with the institutions as well about how to do that. And looking in, you know, at what, as I said, what we're already doing is starting down that pathway, or maybe fully involved in some of the areas but not in other areas. And he's very gracious about his willingness to share whatever he's learned. He understands that every institution comes through this through a slightly different lens, but that there are some practical lessons I think that he's willing to share.
Would we be more surgical about this and select, you know, a couple of places as opposed to just convening everybody? Or you just make it a free-for-all?
I think that's a very good question. I think we should think through how to be most impactful. But that's right.
Well, most successful and therefore impactful.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Sounds like IUPUI is doing a lot of.
Just feel the need to make a comment here. This is Deb. I think we want to be careful to recognize that our institutions are already doing a lot of things. So a few of their leaders might be able to help in helping us decide what's the best way to use him and take advantage of him. The one thing I think that faculty and sometimes administrators like the least is to have the external person come in and solve your problems. So getting him, and he's so good that there has to be a really good way to link him to some of the stronger leadership we have and start with that.
Well, let us reach out and talk to some of the institutions and see. There were the ones in the audience were very engaged in listening to Tim, and I know, so maybe we can reach out and see and measure the interest in and how we can facilitate some of that.
Yeah, they may come right, come up themselves with interest. So
Good point. So moving to the business items, the first item is the Franklin Bannon Grant Schedule of Awards, which we discussed this morning. Colby led the discussion. Are there any other questions from Colby? Is there a motion? Is there a second? All in favor? Aye. Opposed, same sign. And the performance funding by the two ladies, Jasmine and Elisa. Alexa, sorry. Any additional questions to them? Is there a motion? Is there a second? All in favor? Aye. Opposed, same sign. Academic degree program for expedited action, the Master of Science in Data Science, to be offered by Ball State University. It's for expedited action. Is there a motion? Second? All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Same sign. And then capital project for expedited action of Ball State University STEM and Health Professions Phase 3. Is there a motion? A second? Second. All in favor? Aye. Opposed, same sign. That passes. And I think that completes all of our old business. Is there any new business that anyone would like to raise? Well, we are adjourned at our next meeting, not till June.
That's correct, but we will be in contact with you many times in many ways.
Good. And I think this is a very productive meeting, and thanks to everyone for your attention and engagement and comments and questions. And Colleen, best of luck to you.
Yes. Thank you. Come back.
Come back.
I'll be back.
That's the same to Alfonso.
Yes, Alfonso's going to be with us in here.
You'll get to see him.
Thank you, ladies. Parking Valley.
Thank you all. Have a good day.
Thanks.
Just trying to get them all the way
Thank you.
I didn't turn it off yet, but I did stop
Okay,
the recording.
great,
so.
thank you, I
Cool.
appreciate it.
Awesome.
It's awesome, everything's
Cool.
good.
Yeah.
Hopefully not.
Good to see you again if I don't catch up. Hold on.